One Friday evening in October, when I was a senior in high school, I decided that instead of going out with my friends, I was just going to have a quiet, relaxing night at home. I needed time to myself after a crazy, stressful week. My parents were out with friends, and my little sister was spending the night with one of the neighborhood girls, so I would have the house all to myself. A rare occurrence. I took a long, hot shower, put on a face mask, and then ordered a pizza for delivery. I went to the kitchen to make some popcorn and prepare a cup of tea. I had just placed the popcorn in the microwave when I heard a knock on the door. I was confused. It was too early for the pizza guy to be here, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I went to the front door and opened it, but there was no one there. Strange. Maybe whoever it was had just been at the wrong house, realized it, and left? I went back inside and took the popcorn out of the microwave and put it into a bowl. As I was doing this, the home phone rang. Everyone in my family has cell phones, but we keep the landline just in case of an emergency. I figured it was just a salesperson, but I answered the phone anyway. I could hear someone breathing on the other end, but they didn't say anything. After a few seconds, I hung up. I started a movie, and then the doorbell rang again a little while later. This time, it was the pizza guy. I paid him and took the pizza inside. I sat it down in the living room and went back to the movie. It was a horror flick that had recently come out. It might not have been the best idea to watch a scary movie while I was home alone, just a few weeks before Halloween, but I didn't consider that at the time. About half an hour went by and the home phone rang yet again. Annoyed that the call was interrupting my movie, I answered with a sassy tone.
"How are you this fine evening, Anna?"
A male voice I didn't recognize said on the other line. I was surprised the person knew me by my name. "Who is this?" I asked, figuring maybe it was some guy from school playing a prank on me.
"You don't need to know my name,"
the person told me in a creepily calm voice. "You know, I'm not really in the mood to play games right now. Why don't you call someone else and bother them?" I told the man on the other line.
"How's the movie, Anna?"
My blood ran cold. "How do you know I'm watching a movie?" I asked him.
"Because I can see you, of course."
I froze in terror. I glanced around at the windows, all of which were open. I raced to the door and put the deadbolt in place. I then rushed around the house, pulling all the blinds down so no one from outside could see in. All the while, I stayed on the phone with the man. As I was closing the blinds, he said,
"What's the matter, Anna? Are you scared?"
"What do you want from me?" I asked him. There was a brief pause before he said,
"I want to see what your guts look like when I slice you open."
I felt faint and sunk to the ground to avoid passing out. "This has gone on long enough. Goodbye," I said.
"Don't you dare hang up on me,"
I could hear him say before he clicked off the line. I ran upstairs to my bedroom and locked the door behind me. I then grabbed my cell phone and dialed 911. When I explained the situation to the dispatcher, she assured me that the police were on their way and just to stay put. No matter what, I should not open the front door until I was certain it was the police. Before long, I could hear police sirens and saw red and blue flashing lights from outside. "Thank God," I said to myself. I walked back downstairs and heard a knock at the door. "This is the police," a man shouted. I looked through the peephole and there were several officers, all holding up their badges. I opened the door and one of them came inside while the rest stayed outside to check the property for whoever had been harassing me. Meanwhile, I called my parents and told them about what was happening. They assured me that they were on their way home. After a while, the officers that had been outside my house came to the door. They looked very concerned. They told me that they had not found the person who had been harassing me, but that he had left a very disturbing sign. Although they told me not to look, I pushed past them until I was in my driveway. My jaw dropped when we saw it. The pumpkins that my sister and I had recently carved had been smashed against my garage door. There was black spray paint on the driveway that spelled out the message, "Next time, it will be your guts that will be splattered." I was shocked into silence. All I could do was stare at the mess before me. "Don't worry, miss, we'll make sure you're protected," the officer closest to me said. His words offered very little comfort to me. I now knew that there was someone out there who wanted to kill me and would go to great lengths to do so. In the coming weeks, my life changed quite a bit. My parents installed a new security system, our neighbors put in surveillance cameras, and my school resource officer was alerted of the situation. I was never left home alone or allowed to go out in public without my parents or a group of friends with me. More and more time passed and I hadn't heard from the stalker again. I began to think it was just some fluke, maybe someone who was just bored and wanted to mess with me. I began to resent the extra precautions everyone around me were taking to ensure my safety. All I wanted was to live a normal life and enjoy my high school experience like everyone else. Eventually, senior skip day arrived at my school. There was an amusement park located about half an hour away from our school, and the plan was that instead of going to school the next Friday, all the seniors would meet at the amusement park and ride roller coasters all day. It was a tradition that seniors at our school would do every year. When I proposed the idea to my parents, they were definitely concerned. They told me it just wasn't safe. We didn't know who the person was that had harassed me that night or if he was still stalking me. There would be loads of people at the amusement park and it would be very hard to keep me safe. I assured them that I would stick with a big group of people and we would be perfectly fine. It took a lot of convincing, but eventually they agreed to let me go. They made me promise not to go off on my own and to keep my cell phone with me at all times. Both things I agreed to do. On the morning of senior skip day, my best friend picked me up in her mom's minivan. There were 5 other girls in the car already. By the time we arrived at the amusement park, dozens of our classmates were already there. The plan was to break into smaller groups depending upon what rides people were most interested in, and then meet up all together for lunch at noon at the food court, which was located at the center of the amusement park. I broke off into the same group of friends that I had traveled with. We all agreed that the first roller coaster we wanted to ride was the Legend. It was an old but famous roller coaster that was known for being one of the fastest roller coasters in the country. As we had expected, there was quite a long line leading up to the roller coaster. The employee manning the ride told us that we all needed to get into groups of 2 depending on who we wanted to sit with. It was 2 people per row. Initially, me and my best friend Jennifer planned to sit together, but our other friend Callie was left without a seatmate. She was the most scared of going on the ride out of all of us and was terrified to ride alone. She was freaking out so much that I told her she could ride with Jennifer and I would be the odd man out. I knew this meant that I would be riding with a stranger, but I didn't really mind. After all, the ride would be over in less than a couple minutes anyway. I was at the very back with Callie and Jennifer ahead of me. One of the employees that was running the ride came to each row to ensure everyone's safety bar was properly in place. When he got to my row and realized that the seat next to me was empty, he called out to the crowd that was still in line. "We can fit one more, whoever's next in line, come forward," he shouted. Just then, a man from the front of the line began hurrying forward. He looked to be around my dad's age. I assumed that he was probably there with kids and there was an odd number in his family. He was probably going ahead of them so that the rest of his family members could have a seatmate. I smiled at him as he seated alongside of me. "Hey there, how are you?" I asked politely as his safety bar was secured into place. He turned to look at me, a strange smile across his face.
I'm doing great, Anna. How about you?
As soon as he spoke, my blood ran cold. I recognized the voice immediately. Without any fragment of a doubt, I knew that it was the same man that had harassed me over the phone earlier that year. I screamed help and leaned forward to tap my friend on the shoulder, but it was too late. The ride had already taken off, and the only thing that could be heard was the wind rushing by the screams of people around me. The next thing I remember is the man putting his arms around my neck and squeezing hard. I was struggling and fighting him off as best I could, but he was a lot stronger than I was. The roller coaster suddenly took an unexpected nosedive and we were tipped upside down. This caught the man off guard and I used his moment of hesitation to free myself from his grip. After what seemed like hours but what was really only minutes, we finally came to a halt at the same place we boarded the roller coaster. I was screaming my head off, which at first caught no one's attention. Everyone thought I was screaming because of how scary the ride had been. It wasn't until Jennifer looked over her shoulder and saw the man placing his fingers around my neck that she realized what was happening and began calling for security. What happened next was a total blur. All I can remember is Jennifer screaming for help while security officers swarmed around us. The man continued to squeeze his fingers around my throat until things went completely black. The next thing I remember is waking up in a sterile room. Everything around me was white and I was hooked up to several machines. I blinked over and over again as I tried to get my bearings. Suddenly, my parents appeared on either side of the bed. They assured me that I was safe and well taken care of. They explained to me that my stalker had finally been caught. Much to my shock, they had been able to identify my stalker as a man who had once worked for my father's orthodontic business. My dad had fired him for stalking one of their patients. In order to get revenge, the man ended up stalking me. He thought that if he was able to kill me, he would have managed to get revenge on my dad. When I was in high school, I worked as a waitress at a local diner in order to make some extra money so I could save up for college. The owner of the diner was my best friend's dad. He paid me well and made sure that I was always treated with respect by both the customers and the staff. He even let me work on my homework in the back if we were having a slow night. I would typically work for several hours after school and would cover an occasional weekend. On one particular shift, I was working late on Saturday night. Our diner stayed open until 1 a.m. on the weekends. That evening, we had a rush of people around 10 p.m. They were loud and many were drunk. The alcohol seemed to make them extra generous because I was making more money through tips than usual. After the rush had cleared out, I got busy cleaning up tables and taking dishes to the kitchen to be washed. There were only a few diners left and the restaurant was pretty quiet. I was the only waiter left and it was just the kitchen staff, the dishwashers, and the owner who were still in the restaurant. At one point, an older man walked into the restaurant and took a seat at one of the tables. I went over to hand him a menu and take his drink order. The first thing I noticed was that he smelled heavily of booze. This wasn't exactly an uncommon characteristic of people that came into the diner this late. The man was unshaven and it seemed as if it had been a long time since he had showered. I ignored this and asked him what he would like to drink. "I'll take a coffee, black, and your number." I let out an awkward laugh and said, "I'll be right back with your coffee," and headed back to the kitchen. Maybe he didn't realize that I was only a teenager. I brought the man the coffee and then asked if he knew what he wanted to eat. He ordered a steak with mashed potatoes and gravy on the side. I took down his order and turned to walk away, and as I was walking, he called out, "Still waiting on that number." I acted like I didn't hear him. Because the restaurant wasn't busy, his food was prepared very quickly. I dragged my feet when I went to get it. I was dreading having to face that man again. I picked up the plate and set it down in front of him. "You're not gonna make me ask for your number, are you?" Once again, I pretended not to hear him. I turned to leave and he grabbed my wrist hard enough to cause me to gasp. "Don't ignore me, you little tease." "I suggest you take your hands off her immediately," a loud voice said from behind me. I turned and it was the owner. He had just walked out of the kitchen and he saw the whole thing. "You need to leave," he told the man in a firm voice. "We'll give you your meal to go, but you need to leave." The man immediately began protesting and cursing the owner out. I took the plate of food away and quickly moved it into a to-go box. I handed it to the owner, who gave it to the man while he escorted him out the door. I expected for the man to put up a fight, but he eventually gave in and left. I assumed he realized that he had just gotten a free meal and it was best to just leave before someone took it away. The owner apologized to me for the incident and even told me that I could go home early if I wanted. I assured him that I was fine and I could finish out the night. Luckily, the rest of the night was pretty uneventful. When it came time to leave, I clocked out and hung up my apron. When the owner saw that I was getting ready to leave, he asked to accompany me to make sure I got home safely. I told him that wasn't necessary and I would be fine. I only lived a little over a block away from the diner. I had walked home by myself countless times and never had an incident. It was a small town where most people knew everyone else. Because I worked at the diner, lots of residents in our town knew who I was and looked out for me. I grabbed my purse and headed out into the night. Even though I never had an incident before, I still was sure to stay aware of my surroundings and not look at my phone. I had barely crossed the parking lot when I heard the crunch of leaves underfoot closely behind me. I spun around and saw that it was the drunk man from the restaurant. He grabbed me roughly by the shoulders and knocked me down to the ground. I screamed as loud as I could. The man began kicking me over and over again while cursing me out. I was spitting out blood and doing anything I could to protect my head. Suddenly, I heard a familiar voice from close by. "Put your hands up or I'll shoot!" I looked up and it was the owner of the restaurant. He was pointing a gun directly at my attacker. My attacker put up his hands and slowly backed away from me. "The police are on the way," he said. "Don't worry, we're going to get you help. Try to stay awake," he told me. It felt like forever before the police and paramedics arrived. The last thing I remember is being loaded into an ambulance. Although I lost a lot of blood, I miraculously had no broken bones and was able to leave the hospital several days later. The man was arrested and remains in prison. After that, I was escorted home every single time I worked, and I never complained about it. When I was in college, I needed a way to make some extra money. I had a lot of student loan debt that I would have to be prepared to pay once I graduated that year. One of my friends suggested that I look for a nanny job somewhere close to campus. I loved kids, so this sounded like a great idea. I went onto the Facebook page of our town and wrote a quick post sharing a little bit of information about myself and said that if anyone needed a part-time nanny to feel free to contact me. I received a few responses, but each one of the people who reached out lived too far away from me. Finally, I got one response that interested me. It was from a man who lived only about 15 minutes away from me, and I could walk and not use any gas at all. He said that he had 2 daughters, one that was 4 and the other was 2. His wife had passed away while giving birth to the 2-year-old. He had taken his time to grieve and now was feeling ready to go back out into the dating scene. He was hoping to meet someone special that could serve as a mother figure for his girls. He was hoping for someone to come a couple of evenings a week so that he could go out with his friends and try to meet someone. I was touched by his story and felt called to help out. I had been raised by a single parent and had seen firsthand how challenging it can be. I gave him my phone number and we agreed that I would come that Friday evening at 7 p.m. When Friday rolled around, I put the address into the GPS app on my phone and headed on my way. I was a little surprised when the app led me into a pretty sketchy neighborhood. There were barbed wire fences, bars over windows, and broken beer bottles laying in the street. This didn't look like any sort of area to raise children in, but I wasn't one to judge. I eventually made it to my destination. It was a white house, small but well kept. I looked around, but saw no sign of children's toys in the front yard. I approached the door and knocked on it a few times. "Come on in, the door's unlocked," a man's voice said from inside. Figuring he was probably just busy cooking or something, I opened the door. The first thing I noticed when I walked in was the smell. It smelled terrible. It was a smell I couldn't place. The decor was old-fashioned and out of date, but the house seemed relatively clean. "Hello?" I walked across the living room towards the kitchen looking for the dad. The floor creaked behind me, and before I could turn around, something slammed against my head so hard that I saw stars. I was on the ground, stunned and confused. There was a man probably in his 40s or so standing over me. He picked me up from the ground and began carrying me across the room. This was a trap! He didn't even have kids! How had I been so stupid to fall for it? I had seen so many crime shows in my day. The man reached the bedroom and threw me on the bed. I was struggling, but my head hurt so bad and my brain was fuzzy. I could barely fight back. The man had zip ties on his hands and he was binding my ankles and wrists. He put duct tape over my mouth so I couldn't scream. I was thrashing about, doing anything I could think of to escape, but I was like a rag doll in his hands. He undid my belt and began unzipping my jeans. I knew what was happening next, and I tried my best to mentally prepare myself for it. And suddenly, there was a sudden bang, and the man slumped to the floor unconscious. I was shocked. Someone had come to my rescue. Standing behind the man was a tiny, frail old woman. She was wearing a floral dress, and her white hair was tied up on top of her head in a neat bun. She had a look of pure determination in her eyes, and she was wielding a cane in her hands like a weapon. I couldn't believe she had swung the cane hard enough to knock him out cold. I was still processing what had happened, but this woman was all business. I always knew that waste of space was up to no good. I just had a feeling in my gut, and my gut hasn't been wrong in 80 years, she said. She was speaking casually, not like she had probably just saved my life. She reached into a massive handbag that she was carrying and pulled out a pair of scissors. She got to work on cutting the zip ties, freeing me. Once she had finished, she gestured for me to follow her. Well, come on now, he won't stay asleep forever. I struggled to my feet and followed her out of the house. She let me into her house, which was directly across the street. Once we were inside, she locked the door behind us. I've already called the police. They're on their way, she told me. Sit down on the couch and I'll fix you a cup of tea. I'll add some brandy to it. Looks like you could use it. My name is Linda, by the way, she said. As we waited on the police, I sipped my tea and Linda continued to chatter on and on. She told me that the man that had attacked me took over the house after he put his mother in the nursing home a few months ago. She went on and on about how the man's mother was perfectly capable of taking care of herself and the house. Linda claimed that the woman's son was just a bum who didn't really care about his mother. She was a widow who had lived alone before. The police and the paramedics arrived at the same time. They wanted to take me to the hospital to get checked out, but I refused. I told them I just had a little headache but was otherwise fine. The man that attacked me was still unconscious by the time the police reached the house. He was immediately taken into custody. Because of this strange situation and the intense smell from inside the house, the police ended up searching the entire property. In the basement of the house, they made a very disturbing discovery. It was the man's mother. As it turned out, he hadn't really put her in a nursing home. He just told everyone that he had. In reality, he killed her and kept her in a barrel in the basement. The man's mother had been superstitious and didn't trust banks, so she kept all of her money in a safe inside of her house. The only person who knew the code to the safe was her one and only child, the man who attacked me. He had stolen all of the cash and was living off of his mother's money. If it hadn't been for my attack, it could have been months, if not years, before her body was discovered. I never thought a little old lady would be the reason I'm alive today. But that's what happened. Be careful out there and sleep tight.
Welcome to the Dark Somnium.
This is long, so I apologize about that. I've never had to tell this story with enough detail to actually explain it all the way, but it is true, and it happened when I was about 6 years old. In a quiet room, if you press your ear against a pillow, you can hear your heartbeat. As a kid, sounded like soft footsteps on a carpeted floor, and so as a kid, almost every night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I would hear these footsteps, and I would be ripped back to consciousness, terrified. For my entire childhood, I lived with my mother in a fairly nice neighborhood that was in a transitional phase. People of lower economic means were gradually moving in, and my mother and I were one of these people. We lived in the kind of house that you would see transported in 2 pieces on the interstate, but my mom took good care of it. There were a lot of woods surrounding the neighborhood that I would play in and explore during the day. But at night, as things often do to a kid, they took on a more sinister feeling. This coupled with the fact that, due to the nature of our house, there was a fairly large crawl space underneath. It filled my mind with imaginary monsters and inescapable scenarios which would consume my thoughts when I was awakened by the footsteps. I told my mom about the footsteps, and she said that I was just imagining things. I persisted enough that she blasted my ears with water from a turkey baster once just to placate me, since I thought that would help. Of course, it didn't. Despite all the creepiness and footsteps, the only weird thing that ever happened was every now and again, I would wake up on the bottom bunk, despite having gone to sleep on the top. But this wasn't really weird, since I'd sometimes get up to piss or get something to drink and could remember just going back to sleep on the bottom bunk. I'm an only child, so it didn't matter. This would happen once or twice a week, but waking up on the bottom bunk wasn't too terrifying. But one night, I didn't wake up on the bottom bunk. I'd heard the footsteps, but was too far gone to be woken up by them. And when I was awoken, it wasn't from the sound of footsteps or a nightmare, but because I was cold. Really cold. When I opened my eyes, I saw stars. I saw the woods. I sat up immediately and tried to figure out what was going on. I thought I was dreaming, but that didn't seem right, though neither did being in the woods. There was a deflated pool float right in front of me, one of those ones shaped like a shark. This only added to the surreal feeling, but after a while it seemed like I just wasn't going to wake up because I wasn't asleep. I stood up to orient myself, but I didn't recognize the woods. I played in the woods by my house all the time, so I knew them really well, but if these weren't the same woods, then how could I get out? I took a step and felt a shooting pain in my foot, which knocked me back to where I'd just been laying. I'd stepped on a thorn. By the light of the moon, I could see that they were everywhere. I looked at my other foot, but it was fine, and as a matter of fact, so was the rest of me. I didn't have another scratch on me, and I wasn't even dirty. I cried for a little bit, and then I stood back up. I didn't know which way to go, so I just picked a direction. I resisted the urge to call out since I wasn't sure I wanted to be found by who or what might be out there. I walked for what seemed like hours. I tried to walk in a straight line and tried to course correct when I had to take detours, but I was a kid and I was afraid. There weren't any howls or screams, and only once did I hear any noise that scared me. It sounded like a crying baby. I think now that it was just a cat, but I panicked. I ran, veering in different directions to avoid big thickets of bushes and collapsed trees. I was paying close attention to where I stepped because by that point, my feet were in pretty bad shape. I paid too much attention to where I was stepping and not enough to where those steps were leading because not long after hearing the cry, I saw something that filled me with a kind of despair that I haven't experienced since. It was the pool float. I was only 10 feet from where I'd woken up. This wasn't magic or some supernatural space bending. I was lost. Up until that moment, I thought more about getting out of the woods than how I got in, but being back at the beginning caused my mind to swim. I wasn't even sure that these were my woods. I'd only been hoping that they were. Had I run in a huge circle around the spot, or did I just get turned around and start to make my way back? How was I going to get out? At the time, I thought the North Star was just the brightest star, so I looked and found the brightest one and followed it. Eventually, things started to look more familiar, and when I saw the ditch, a dirt ditch my friends and I would have dirt clod wars in, I knew I'd made it out. I was walking really slowly because my feet hurt so much, but I was so happy to be close to home that I broke into a light jog. When I actually saw the roof of my house over the neighboring lower set house, I let out a light sob and ran faster. I just wanted to be home. I had already decided that I wouldn't say anything because I had no idea what I would actually say. I'd get back in the house somehow, clean up, and get in bed. My heart sank as I rounded the corner and my house came fully into view. Every light in the house was on. I knew my mom was up. I knew I would have to explain or try to explain where I'd been. I couldn't even figure out where to start. My run became a jog, which became a walk. I saw her silhouette through the blinds, and although I was worried about how to explain things to her, that didn't matter to me at that point. I walked up the couple of steps to the porch and put my hand on the doorknob and turned. Right before I pushed it open, 2 arms wrapped around me and pulled me back. I screamed as loud as I could. "Mom, help! Help me!" The feeling of being so close to being safe and then being physically pulled away from it filled me with a kind of dread that is even, after all these years, indescribable. The door I'd been torn away from opened and a flash of hope shot through my heart. But it wasn't my mom. It was a man, and he was enormous. I thrashed around and kicked at the shins of the person holding me while also trying to get away from the person who had just come out of my house. I was scared, but I was furious. "Let me go! Where is she? Where's my mom? What'd you do to her?" As my throat stung from screaming and I was drawing in another breath, I became aware of a sound that had been present for longer than I had perceived it. "Honey, please calm down, I've got you." It sounded like my mom. The arms loosened and set me down, and as the man approaching me blocked out the porch light with his head, I noticed his clothes. He was a cop. I turned to face the voice behind me and saw it really was my mom. Everything was okay. I began to cry. The 3 of us went inside. "I'm so glad you're home, sweetie. I was worried I'd never see you again." By that point, she was crying too. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. I just wanted to come home. I'm sorry. It's okay. Just don't ever do that again. I'm not sure my shins could take it." A little laughter broke through my sobs, and I smiled a bit. "Well, I'm sorry for kicking you, but why'd you grab me like that? I was just afraid you'd run away again." I was confused. "What do you mean?" "We found your note on your pillow," she said, and pointed at the piece of paper that the police officer was sliding across the table. I picked up the note and read it. It was a running away letter. It said that I was unhappy, never wanted to see her or any of my friends again. The police officer exchanged a few words with my mom on the porch while I stared at the letter. I didn't remember writing a letter. I didn't remember anything about any of this. But even if I sometimes went to the bathroom at night and didn't remember, or even if I could have gone into the woods on my own, even if all of that could have been true, the only thing I knew at this point was, this isn't how you spell my name. I didn't write this letter.